Either way, I think that the point is the same, is that most of the time you don't get to know what you're missing, or even that you're missing anything. That's not your role as a player. So if your role here is not to understand, then what is it?
I've been smashing my head around trying to write about the beginner's guide for months. I'm pretty sure I've thought about it at least once every day since I played it, and I still wouldn't say I have a great grasp on it. I may find the beginner's guide scarier than any horror game. It pulls absolutely no punches, and despite a wealth of think pieces on it, it actively resists being analyzed. It lures in critics with tons of themes to dissect, but the process of dissecting those themes reveals an increasing hostility towards the dissectors. It's just a mind-boggling experience. So why am I, a Z-, list critic with not nearly the pedigree of others who have tried to take on this game, trying to take on this game? I have no idea, maybe to get it out of my head because it won't leave me alone. Also, total, complete, forwards and backwards spoilers. Just play the game. The Beginner's Guide is a game created by Davey Wreden, the creator of The Stanley Parable, another first-person narrative-driven game overseen by a narrator. Despite covering all those same bases, they're more or less complete opposites. The Stanley Parable is meticulous, purposefully designed, which makes easy-to-digest points. The Beginner's Guide is messy, made to reflect the designs of a single developer who never intended for their work to be seen. The Stanley Parable is a comedy examining video game tropes, and The Beginner's Guide is a tragedy examining the consequences of real-life actions. Even the stuffy narration of The Stanley Parable is in direct contrast with the aching humanity of The Beginner's Guide. So what is this game? Well, on a basic level, and this is your last spoiler warning, The Beginner's Guide is the fictional story of Davey Wreden guiding a player through a number of experiments made by a developer named Coda. Through an earnest and well-spoken narration, Davey explains that he's going to use his collection to gain real insight into Coda's mind and sense who they are as a person. The experiments in games start bursting with ideas and creative energy and enthusiasm, but they slowly begin to sink into desperation and begin directly addressing the creative lull that Coda appears to be in. Davey explains that he became so worried for Coda that he decided to go against their wishes and show the games to others, all while spreading the idea that Coda is in a big depressive slump. And then the game completely flips. In Coda's final game, we find out that A, Coda is not depressed, B, that Davey has been editing the games to make them fall more in line with his interpretation of them, meaning we can't count on anything we've seen or heard in the game as being representative of Coda's actual work, and C, that Coda cut Davey off after he showed their games to other people. Davey has a breakdown about no longer having Coda's work around, saying that showing off his interpretations is the only time he's ever liked himself. Davey rambles about his need for validation and then disappears. So, where to even start? This game might be the most audacious bait and switch I've ever seen in fiction. At first it's just oozing with all sorts of juicy tidbits of critic bait, just begging to be discussed and admired, like how the obvious artificiality of the Counter-Strike map and the Ascension glitch in the Whisper Machine game are oddly humanizing in their gaminess, or the idea of having incredible warmth and creativity that very few people will ever be able to access, or the idea of using your work as a substitute for social expression, and the other's work as a substitute for social interaction, even just escapism and the comfort of menial tasks. And of course there's all the themes of desperation and depression and creative stagnation that critics love so much. And it's all a lie. Our narrator is unreliable, the games he shows us are unreliable, and everything he spins about Coda is infinitely more true of himself. The loneliness, the need for validation, the creative lull, it's all Davey. So, what can we possibly get out of this? In my opinion, it would be impossible to write a definitive piece on the Beginner's Guide. There's just too much to go into, but here's 3 thought processes that it kickstarted for me, as kind of a sampler pack, I guess.
But ultimately we don't really know. Maybe Coda thought that actually it was complete the way that it is. And I think that we should talk about his games for what they are, rather than for what they're not.
This one's pretty obvious, especially if you've been on this channel before, but how many other video games actively argue for death of the author? Like, name one. This is largely uncharted for video games, even if it's well established in other art. Davy's fundamental problem is his overvaluing of authorial intent. Davy is looking for truth, for a correct answer, and to him the easiest way to achieve that is to get the authorial stamp of approval. And since Coda doesn't tell him anything, he's left to discern intent for himself, which leads to projection. As Innuendo Studios pointed out, and link in the description to his excellent video, perception of authorial intent is just that, a perception, a construct that is far more rooted in the viewer than it is the creator. But even if Coda was completely open about their intent, which incidentally still would not be the end-all be-all of interpretations of their work, Davy makes an even graver mistake. He values this perception of the author, the search for this construct of meaning, above the more practical wishes of the actual person who made the games. Look, I love art, and I love art criticism. The search for emotional and thematic meaning in a piece is something I live for, but if the path you take to find or share meaning directly hurts another person, you need to reorder your priorities. The construct of the authorial voice may matter more in the abstract, but we don't live in the abstract. We live in the real world, and in the real world, the real person matters more. It's a nuanced take on the concept that I don't think I've ever seen before.
This is something that he and I used to argue about a lot. You know, whether a game ought to actually be playable, whether it means anything if no one can get through it. And I would always defend that, you know, all this work goes into the game, why not make it playable and accessible? And so we just got into heated arguments over it, and there was one time that after one of these conversations, he went home, and a day or two later, he sent me a zip file entitled Playable Games that was full of hundreds of individual games, each of which was just an empty box that you walked around in, and nothing else. Believe me, I played every single one of those just to find out if there was like a gag hidden somewhere. There wasn't.
It's a common talking point among critics that it's impossible to make a piece of art that appeals to everyone. Usually this is brought up in the context of something that spreads itself too thin, that tries to appeal soullessly to a wide audience when a more niche goal would have made a far more compelling experience. The Beginner's Guide has a take on this idea that is both daring and oddly common sense. The audience can be any size, like any size, up to and including a single person. Think of all the unfinished drafts of any kind that have existed. Writing, music, film, gaming. Many of these drafts aren't intended for anyone but the eyes of the creator. Whether it was a bad idea, or the creator ran out of steam, or they're ashamed of it now, or they just really wanted to experiment to see if they could do something. It's a simple reality of creation that rarely gets talked about. There's this unspoken understanding in the art world that only a finished product counts as art, and that the people who see it beforehand don't really count as the audience. But the Beginner's Guide tramples on that, showing the damage that Davy causes by not respecting the limits of the audience. But you might say, this is far too specialized of a scenario. How many of us know a creator who doesn't want their work to be seen, and how much smaller is that number when you consider the people who are actually in a position to spread that work against the creator's will? How does the message of the audience has limits apply to normal people? To answer this question, we have to talk about lips.
Michael Rennie was ill the day the earth stood still, but he told us where we stand.
Rocky Horror, as a whole property, but especially the movie, hit me at an absolutely pivotal time in my life. I'm not going to be dramatic and say that it was responsible for my queer awakening or anything like that, but, you know, my obsession with it, let's say, mentally prepared me far more deeply than I could have imagined. I wanted to be Brad and Janet, to be taken away from cis-heteronormative society and be seduced by this world of literal aliens. It was escapism that had real-world consequences the more self-exploration I did. It enriched my life, to put it simply. I can't imagine getting to where I am now without it. That's a story you hear from a lot of queer folks I've experienced with Rocky Horror. It's often held up as a beacon by those of us who are positively affected by it. It's almost religious, but there've not only been skeptics of the film who don't get how a story with the most visibly queer character fills the villainous mad scientist role in addition to being a murderer and a rapist is progressive, but There have been those whose venom for Rocky Horror takes a less detached role. As well they should, because it's directly negatively affected them. There's been people who have had their self-discovery stunted because they didn't want to be seen like Frankenfurter, or who mainly have their queerness viewed by others as a freak show through the lens of the film, or any other number of reasons to have a grudge against it, especially since Richard O'Brien has been very turfy in recent times. So, what does this have to do with the beginner's guide? Well, it's not so much a theme of the game as a lesson to be learned from the game. The message the beginner's guide communicates about the audience having limits is a good thing to keep in mind when trying to handle these discussions empathically. Like, trying to logistically decide whether the existence of Rocky Horror is justified by weighing the amount of people who've been helped by it versus hurt by it is a worthless trolley problem sort of deal, but by keeping in mind that Rocky Horror can't be the same thing to everyone, or even a good thing to everyone, it allows the discussion to be more understanding. It makes it easier to acknowledge both ways that Rocky Horror has affected people and be empathic to those on the other side. The same goes for any piece of art. I adore The Evil Dead, but no way would I try to convince somebody who's triggered by the tree scene that it's a good movie. All the creativity and passion and craft does not matter to that audience, and that's okay, it can't be changed now. Just let it be. We should respect other people's boundaries, for good and for bad, or we'll find ourselves closer to Davy's position than we would like.
I remember, it's June of 2011, I'm playing this for the very first time, and as I'm playing, I'm thinking to myself, I don't know this person. I have no idea who this person is. It wasn't the guy I knew, it wasn't my friend. I had come to so many conclusions from looking at all of his work up to this point, and then suddenly none of them.
After the cerebral but comedic Stanley Parable, the bleak words of warning from the beginner's guide are all the more chilling, but maybe there's something positive to be gleaned from its warning. Davy's mistake is hurting Coda, which he does by projecting his own need for validation onto them. Davy is a bad critic because he has a distorted view of the relationship between himself, the art, and the creator. But what if we looked at it another way? Davy doesn't acknowledge that his analysis of Coda's work is not interchangeable with the work itself. It's transformative. The construct of Coda in his mind is his own creation, but if he acknowledged that, he could have come to terms with his problems earlier instead of living in denial. Besides which, though he thinks he can only be happy by living vicariously through Coda's work, it's not actually Coda's work that energized him, it's his interpretation of Coda's work. Coda didn't make that interpretation, he did. If Davy would pull back, he would realize that he's what he wants to be already, a creator. The Beginner's Guide, through showing us the dangers and the negative, implicitly shows us that criticism is its own work of art, that the critic is an artist. Wouldn't keeping that in mind allow better, more individual criticism? I mean, I don't know, you tell me, you're the smart one.